There's a very specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from a lack of sleep. It comes from a lifetime of being awake, long before you were supposed to be. If you grew up hearing the phrase, "you were so mature for your age," you probably wore it like a badge of honor. Adults looked at you with a mixture of relief and admiration. You didn't throw tantrums. You didn't ask for too much. You were the quiet one, the responsible one, the old soul trapped in a small body. But looking back now, in the quiet solitude of your adult life, that compliment feels less like a medal and more like an autopsy report. Because what they called maturity was actually a quiet, desperate adaptation. You weren't an old soul. You were just a child who realized very early on that it wasn't safe to be young. Psychology has a term for this, parentification. But clinical words often fail to capture the visceral reality of a childhood stripped away. It is better understood through the metaphor of the premature architect. Imagine being a child handed the blueprints to a house while a violent storm is already breaking the windows. You don't get to play in the mud. You don't get to marvel at the walls. You just have to build the roof as fast as humanly possible so the people inside don't drown. When you grow up in an environment of emotional unpredictability, whether due to a parent's illness, financial ruin, volatile arguments, or their own unhealed trauma, a subconscious exchange takes place in your mind. You trade your innocence for a sense of control. You become the thermostat of the household, constantly reading the emotional temperature of the room. A slammed door, a heavy sigh, a lingering silence, these weren't just background noises to you. They were vital data. You became a hyper-vigilant observer, learning to anticipate the needs and moods of the adults around you before they even knew what they needed themselves. You became the mediator, the confidant, the tiny anchor holding a sinking ship together. This dynamic inflicts a form of invisible micro-trauma. It doesn't always leave physical scars, but it performs a slow, quiet, emotional erosion. It erodes the fundamental right every child has, the right to be careless, the right to fall apart and trust that someone bigger, stronger, and wiser will put you back together. When you are the one holding the glue, you learn very quickly that your own needs are a liability. You shrink them. You fold them away into a dark, inaccessible corner of your mind, convincing yourself that you simply don't have them. "I'm fine" becomes your default setting, not because you are fine, but because the environment cannot afford for you to be anything else. This creates a profound psychological phenomenon known as ambiguous loss. It is a haunting kind of grief that has no grave to visit. You are mourning something that never physically died, yet is undeniably gone. The childhood you were owed. You watch other people recount memories of carefree summers, of making mistakes without the world ending, of being foolish and loud and wonderfully burdensome. And you feel a strange hollow ache in your chest. You realize you skipped a chapter. You went straight from the prologue to the heavy climax of the story. The tragedy of the child who grows up too fast is that your emotional intelligence outpaces your emotional capacity. You understood complex adult emotions, grief, existential stress, marital resentment, with the fragile cognitive framing of a 10-year-old. You absorbed the toxicity of adult problems without the emotional immune system to process it. You learned how to survive, yes. You learned how to manage, fix, and endure. But as you step into actual adulthood, the architecture of your survival begins to show its cracks. The hyper-independence that kept you safe back then becomes the very invisible wall keeping you isolated now. You find yourself deeply exhausted by the compulsion to fix everyone around you, terrified of relying on anyone else, and haunted by a persistent, quiet emptiness. The storm is long past, but you are still standing out in the rain, holding the roof up with both trembling hands, wondering when it will finally be your turn to be held. It is a terrifying realization,
understanding that your greatest strength, your unyielding self-reliance, is also the very source of your deepest wound. For years, you have mistaken this heavy armor for your actual skin. You wore it for so long to protect yourself against the cold unpredictability of your environment that it fused to your bones. But I need you to pause, right now, and recognize something crucial. Your hyper-independence is not a character flaw. It is a masterpiece of survival. When you were small and the world was vast and terrifying, your mind did something miraculous. It sacrificed its own ease to ensure your safety. You built a fortress out of perfectionism and people-pleasing because that was the only currency you had to buy peace. You learned to read the room so you wouldn't become the casualty of it. Your maturity was a brilliant, necessary adaptation to a world that failed to protect your innocence. You did exactly what you had to do. But here is the gentle, necessary truth of the present. The war is over. You are no longer that small, helpless child navigating an emotional minefield. You are an adult, sitting in a quiet room, still operating on the emergency protocols of a crisis that ended a long time ago. You are wearing heavy battle armor to a peaceful dinner table. It kept you alive in the crossfire, yes, but now it is only keeping you from feeling the warmth of the sun, the touch of a gentle hand, and the terrifying beauty of letting someone else carry the weight. Healing from a rushed childhood does not mean you can go back and reclaim the years you lost. That is the bitter, quiet ache of ambiguous loss. You cannot unsee the storm, and you cannot unlearn the survival skills that kept you breathing. But healing does mean you can consciously decide to stop building roofs for people who are perfectly capable of holding their own umbrellas. It means rewriting the silent contract you made with yourself when you were too young to know better. You have to teach your nervous system that it is finally safe to stand down. This is the slow, deliberate art of self-healing. It requires looking inward at that exhausted, hyper-vigilant inner child and whispering the words you always deserved to hear. You do not have to be useful to be loved. You do not have to earn your space on this earth by fixing everyone around you. You are allowed to be messy. You are allowed to not have the answers. You are allowed to be inconvenient. You are allowed to drop the heavy glass balls you have been juggling for decades and just watch them shatter, finally realizing that the world will not end when they do. You have spent an entire lifetime being the anchor for everyone else's sinking ship. But the storm has passed. It is time to cut the rope. Let them learn to sail. It is time, at long last, to let yourself float.